how we've got to. Do you want to start again, given we're recording now? Shall I just kick off again? So I'm going to talk about the Redington Frognal Neighbourhood Plan and how it's used in decision-making and the status of the plan, but also then going to particularly look at the Redington Frognal area, and in particular how the heritage and character and other policies how we should consider those. So really just running through sort of the different aspects of character in the area and how they should be considered. Okay, so right, I've got a problem actually with, I'll use the mouse, it doesn't like the keyboard buttons for some reason. So really, I'm just going to kick off about talking about the status of the plan, how it's actually used in decision making. As I mentioned, talking a little bit about heritage and character, and then conclusions. And you can tell I've moved things around on this list. That's why they're coming up in the wrong order there. So just a bit about the context of plans. And obviously the Redington Frognal Neighbourhood Plan was made last year. So by made, that means that the plan had to go through an examination process to make sure it had taken account of national policy and guidance, of strategic local policy, to make sure that the plan was helping to achieve sustainable development, so that's growth, but also considering future generations, and to make sure that its environmental impacts on habitats, etc., had been considered. And then when the plan went through examination, it was subject to a referendum, and unlike a local plan where there's an adoption decision, the local authority has to decide to adopt the plan. With a neighbourhood plan, it comes into force automatically when there's a yes vote in the referendum. So at that point, it becomes part of the statutory development plan. And what that means is it has to be taken into account in making decisions on planning applications. So the statutory development plan now for this area is the London plan, Camden's local plan, adopted local plan, and the Redington Frognal Neighbourhood Plan. But there's a requirement in law to determine applications in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So that means development should follow what the development plan policies say, unless there's a really, really good planning reason and an explicitly made planning reason to depart from those policies. But also, it makes clear also in the government's guidance on the development plan that where plans say slightly different things, it's the later plan that carries more weight. So it isn't necessarily the any particular tier of plan, it's the later plan that was made or adopted that will carry more weight. So if the plans say different things, that's how we determine which direction to go in. So so this is statutory policy. It has real weight in law, and applications should be determined in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So I'm just going to run next through how it's actually used in the decision-making process. I don't know if there's any questions yet. If anyone wants to just let me know if anyone wants to ask a question now, or we can take questions at the end. No? Oh, okay, I'll press on. So, so the plan has to be used with a determination of planning applications, and some of those, as we know, will be dealt with under delegated powers by officers, and some will go to committee. So I think the delegated ones, there's often a note on file on how the decision's been reached, and obviously anything that goes to committee has to have a report. And I just thought I'd set out some of the things to look for in the officer reports, and apologies for the order again of those appearing. So, excuse me. So basically, you'd expect in a report to see as much emphasis on the neighbourhood plan as the local plan. And so, you know, a similar level of analysis really against the specific policies of the plans. Also, there are special duties in law applying to heritage, and I'll show you these later, but basically for conservation areas and listed buildings, the local authority has to pay special attention to for listed buildings, the desirability of preserving the building or its setting, and for conservation areas have to pay special attention to the desirability of preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of the conservation area. And from past challenges that have been made to planning decisions, we know that really it needs to be explicit how they've been considered. So it should be made clear that these duties have been given proper consideration. As I mentioned, the later plan should be given more weight when policies say different things, so you'd expect that to be recognised in a report. And where there's a departure from the policies of the neighbourhood plan or the local plan, actually, that needs to be explicit. The planning justification for that should be set out. And this is so that the report demonstrates that it's taken account of different aspects of the law. So, I mean, I thought I'd give a couple of examples. I'm not going to run through all the policies of the plan, but I thought I'd give a couple of examples. And the policy are written very much in a checklisty kind of way, so that the officer concerned or the elected member can check down the list of whether the development proposal in question has met the requirements of the policy or not. And obviously for anyone commenting on planning applications as well, it's important to relate any representation to not just the neighbourhood plan, but the local plan, neighbourhood plan, where applicable the London plan, but particularly the local plan and neighbourhood plan. Anyone making representations, so sending a letter in on development, the more that can be related to policy, the clearer the representation, and national policy, of course, as well. Making references to national policy. So the decision makers are going to have to use these policies. They should determine in accordance with the policies unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So there's a real weight given to local policy in local plans and neighbourhood plans. So it's got to make sense to use them in making representations, because that's how the decision maker is gonna have to consider them as well. So some matters of policy are quite binary, and it's clear whether a development will have followed the policy or not. Some of them are a little more about influencing or emphasising issues. So policy works in different ways. Some policies enable things to happen, so they make clear what will be acceptable. Some will have very clear requirements, and it's going to be pretty clear whether the development complies or not. Some are going to be more encouraging, and it's really to justify a refusal or to lead to a refusal. It's where there's going to be conflict, in particular where there's clear conflict with policies that a scheme could be in difficulties. Now, there may be other material considerations that that indicate a development could go ahead still. So there is flexibility in the system, but the starting point and really is to follow the policies, and it does need a clear justification if there's a scheme were to be approved where there was a clear departure from the policy. So this is a diagram I showed to town and parish councils on decisions, and really where there are concerns over a decision, this is it's a simplified checklist really, that just sets out what the decision should have done. So are decisions made in accordance with NPPF stands for the National Planning Policy Framework, so that's national policy on planning, local plan policies, and the neighbourhood plan. And if the decision has followed those, that's fine. And if the decision hasn't, then the question is there a clear reason why? You know, you would expect to see in any decision a really clear reason why they hadn't been followed. So if there's a good clear reason, that's okay. But if not, there could be challenge. So planning decisions can be challenged sometimes, sometimes this would be about someone writing to the local authority, or there's potential for people who've been affected by a decision, there are ombudsman complaints, or in some instances, I think someone's not muted at the moment, getting quite a bit of background noise. And in some cases, decisions have been challenged in the courts where it looks like proper process hasn't been followed, or certain things haven't been taken into account, or policies and statutory duties haven't been applied properly. So this is how a kind of simplified diagram really of how decisions work. Okay, I'll pause again. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If so, if you just want to unmute and ask your question.
Hello, Dave. It's Linda Chung here. I just thought I'd say that I'll ask my questions at the end, so you're not met by ghostly silence all the time. But it's very interesting, and it's great to meet you because I've heard so much about your work, and it's very interesting. So thank you. And I'll grin at you for 2 seconds, and then you can carry on.
Hi, Linda. Well, good to hear something through the silence, and good to put a face to the name as well. Right. Okay. I'll press on, and then I'll take questions at the end. Okay. So just on the historic environment, particularly, and around the design, character, conservation policies of the plan, I just thought I'd say a little about the character of the area really, and how I think character should be considered in decisions. And this is a really recent quote that was reported in Planning magazine, and quite interesting. PINS is the planning inspectorate, by the way. So the chief of the planning inspectorate really pointed out just how important it is to understand the area, to understand the heritage of an area. And that I'm going to talk through that a little bit. Okay, and I've got plenty of pictures to illustrate what I'm saying, so I'll try to go with pictures rather than bullet point lists, which I know an excess of bullet point lists drive people crazy. Having said that, I've got a bit of text here, I'm afraid. I mentioned the special duties for heritage, and that just gives you the actual wording in law. So this isn't a requirement of policy, this is actually a requirement in law, where different local authorities have taken decisions affecting listed buildings and conservation areas, and they haven't explicitly shown how these duties are being met, or whether there's a real question over whether they're being properly considered, that has resulted in the past in some decisions being quashed. So it's really, really important that the local authority takes these seriously and addresses them in a very direct way. So obviously this affects the Redington Frognal area. These duties apply to the conservation area and listed buildings. There's another duty where you're doing works actually to a listed building, which I think is section 16. And that's very similar, considering the desirability of preserving the building or setting, but that's for the listed building consent application. These relate to planning applications. So the difference, planning is about the use and development of land and the social, economic, environmental considerations and impacts of the development. The listed building consent system it runs in parallel, and where you've got a listed building, you sometimes have to apply for listed building consent as well as, or instead of, sometimes planning permission, and that's where works you undertaken would affect the building's character of a building as a building of special architectural or historic interest, then you need listed building consent as well. So it's a different system with a sort of different emphasis, if you like. Okay. Oh, there you go. It is section 16. That's just appeared at the bottom. So here, obviously, we're talking about a garden suburb, and I think the plan view actually of Redington Frognal. Oh gosh, I hope this is Redington Frognal. Do you know, it might be Fitzjohn's, the area next to you, or part of Redington Frognal. But to be honest, the areas have a very similar character. So although the road layout varies, it's pretty much a similar sort of thing. So both Redington Frognal actually and the Fitzjohn conservation area, which adjoins, they're pretty much garden suburbs with a very strong character. And I'm just going to talk through that character, because I think something that becomes apparent from the picture is this isn't just about buildings. This is about townscape, how the buildings are arranged, but it's very much as well about the pattern of front and rear gardens, and the trees are fundamentally part of that. And so it's as much about the green space and actually not particularly public space. It's more the amalgam of rear and front gardens that create this really green character. And so that's part in understanding heritage. That's part of the character of the area. But something the Redington Frognal Plan does is it looks not just at heritage, but also considerations around amenity and biodiversity, and actually that green environment, that pattern of gardens, the amalgam of rear gardens, the linking up of gardens, and they're not just about character, but that's just as much about the biodiversity of the area, habitats, and an amenity for residents as well. So all of these issues come in, and there are sort of common and parallel aims really for conservation of the historic environment, conservation of the green environment, and considerations around biodiversity, and looking at residential amenity and environmental quality. We're looking at the same things really for those issues in many ways. So I think with heritage, and certainly some of the heritage bodies are quite focused on buildings, but actually they're only part of the character. So in this area, there's there's quite a lot of these sort of Queen Anne revival buildings, which, although it's called a revival and it does much to the past, Queen Anne was kind of a concoction of different elements coming together to create what at the time would have been a modern something a little bit different. So predominant former buildings of this Queen Anne influence, but actually there are other influences as well in the area. So just to show a few of those, on the left we've got a house designed by Voisey, which is in some ways a more radical form of design, but in some ways as well a revival of domestic forms and crafts and the like, and obviously a very distinctive building in the middle with sort of Tudor Gothic elements, and on the right as well a listed building from the post-war part of the 20th century. So it's pretty diverse as well architecturally, and we've got heritage from different different periods, but mainly looking through the 20th century. You know, how design thinking developed during that time. And these are all important parts of the character. The diversity and the set pieces that we see here are just as important as the more perhaps conforming parts of the area where there's a more consistent character. But it's also about townscape and how we saw that from the aerial view, where we saw those really clear streets that would, you know, the streets are defined by rows of buildings set back behind front gardens. So you have road, you have front garden, you've got these rows of buildings, so quite a strong townscape character there, and then the amalgams of rear gardens behind that. So when we're considering character, sometimes the townscape can lead us to slightly different conclusions. So if we look here, I think architecturally this isn't particularly special, but it's not particularly bad either. It's a pretty neutral sort of thing, I think. But in its townscape character and its spatial character, it does reinforce the character. It's a building frontage set back behind front gardens, although sometimes the front gardens have been lost to parking and hard surfacing. So that does eat into the character a little. And it could do with more height on that. So, you know, redevelopment, you could probably do something more exciting there, but actually if that meant the loss of enclosure and a different relationship to the road, that, you know, we need to consider all of these things. So the townscape character, the setback, how it fits in with the surroundings as well. So, you know, further example of again, it's the buildings, the sort of Queen Anne buildings, but it's also the garden space, the hedges, the trees, street trees, partly private trees, partly back garden trees, partly street trees and hedges. They're all important aspects of character. I think the way you can respond to this in new development is very much about understanding that pattern of garden space, of buildings, the sort of general form and massing and setback and of buildings and relationship of building to garden space. So I think when you're doing something in the 21st century, that's how you respond to character. It's not about slavishly copying styles from the past. That isn't what's happened generally in the past, and many historic areas are a result of changing ideas over time. And I feel very much that sort of green considerations should very much influence what we build today, but it's really getting those essentials of character, the townscape, the massing, the pattern of gardens and buildings. They're really important considerations. I mean, again, we see similar, the street trees, the pattern of front gardens, the hedges, the, you know, more of the Queen Anne kind of influenced housing, and you know, again, the way the street is defined by the building frontages, albeit set back. So it's a green gardeny kind of environment. So we contrast that perhaps with a more urban conservation area where it's more rear of the footway, building frontages, and enclosure and definition of streets and spaces is one of the fundamental aspects of character. I think when you're considering character, layout and the way streets and spaces are enclosed and defined by buildings is really your starting point. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of character, and certainly here that's the case. The layout, the garden patterns, and the sort of townscape character are fundamental. I mean, again, similar examples: the Queen Anne houses, the hedges. Pattern of the setback of the buildings. As I said, sometimes front gardens have been turned into hard surfacing, and that does affect character. I seem to be going backwards for some reason. That's better. Going forwards again. But again, just on the architectural diversity, there are influences from all around the world, really. So we have the sort of Queen Anne stuff, but Dutch gables quite common in the area. The modern building we saw earlier obviously draws on European modernism and sort of progressive 20th century movements in architecture. So we see a lot of these different influences, and that's quite important, really. That's and the character of a lot of historic areas, actually, they can be based on local vernacular sometimes. So a lot of villages are more local vernacular, but quite often conservation areas, particularly where there's sort of more formal architecture, or sometimes known as polite architecture, that's often more national or international in its influences. So the locally distinctive identity of Redington Frognal comes from a whole range of different factors, as I've been talking through, but it's also these international influences as well, and these are often the sort of fashions of importing different ideas. So some of the harm to the area. Some of the things that have actually eroded that character to some extent is, I mean, if you just look down this list, the first three are all about loss of green space, and the fifth item is as well. So the green environment, the pattern of garden space, and the planting, landscaping, trees are so important to the understanding the character of the area. And I think with new developments, I'll show a few examples, but I thought new development, often architecturally, it was actually of a reasonable or good standard, but where perhaps the scope for improvement in the future is more emphasis on that pattern of gardens, green space, and how the buildings fit into the sort of pattern of the area. So just a few examples that show that, and it really here, I think there could have, there's a few examples where architecturally, I think they're okay, and there's some good features, but things like the big entrance at ground floor level, or really the emphasis on green space, and particularly to the front. I think there's perhaps been more emphasis on getting the building right than getting the landscape and the green setting, I mean, there's really good exemplars as well, and I was very, very taken with this house. It could have gone a little bit higher, but something that it's got the front garden, it's got that same pattern of garden, building, garden, hedges, etc., and quite a distinctive addition as well, something that actually adds to the architectural interest of the conservation area. Quite interesting staircase. It actually makes you want to go in and have a look at how that staircase works. So So really just to sum up on, obviously the neighbourhood plan, there are policies that explicitly deal with design, the character of the area, landscaping, etc. Really, when we look at the character of the area and look at understanding that, we can see why they were such important considerations, and not just from a historic character point of view, but also wider green and amenity considerations. Anyone who wants to read on neighbourhood plans further, there's a couple of guides here on, the first one on making neighbourhood plans, but the second on after the plan is made, and in particular that guide on the right there has guidance on how to make representations, how to make effective representations. So where representations work well is where they relate to policy, they're really focused on key issues, and there's clear, coherent planning arguments in there. Sometimes I've seen letters of representation where the argument is actually lost in detail and material and description, and so I think effective representations is the art of clear, concise arguments and relating them to policy. There's a guide we wrote for the National Trust on heritage in neighbourhood plans, which you may find interesting, and particularly some of the stuff I've said about understanding the historic environment is covered in that. All of these can be downloaded for nothing, and then there's other aspects of neighbourhood planning on the neighbourhoodplanning.com website. So that's a run through how the neighbourhood plan should be applied, but also understanding the nature of the area. So if anyone's got any questions, then please fire away. I don't think there's too many people, so hopefully if anyone just speaks up, and we'll see if that works. Okay.
Dave, I'm going to ask something about loss of green space and biodiversity. These neighbourhood plans are supposed to be authoritative and have some weight, but we found that in reality, the planners can find all sorts of ways to ignore community views. And in fact, the legislation about loss of gardens and felling of trees, etc., is quite weak. So we find that in our neighbourhood, Redington, Frognal, Hampstead, we're losing a lot of gardens because this so-called PD. So people are getting away with large so-called sheds, offices, and loss of trees, using excuses like they're not of great value and or they're causing subsidence. To what extent do you think that neighbourhood plans have any weight at all when it comes to conflicts like that?
So where something is permitted, I mean, you have just really highlighted a conflict and contradiction in planning law, and also I should mention permitted development rights have expanded considerably in the last couple of years. So permitted development rights are basically certain categories of development which the government sets out in legislation, where you don't need to apply for planning permission, you just have an automatic right to do certain categories of development. And in terms of residential properties, so garden buildings and house extensions, they've expanded quite a lot in the last few years. Now, that does give more rights to the house owner to do what they want, but it also means as a planning application isn't required, policies don't apply, and there's no opportunity for somebody to make representations or to say this, I'm not not happy about this happening. So it's a shift of rights, if you like, to the landowner from the wider area. I mean, if you ask people, should they be able to do what they want with their own house, a lot of people will say yes. And if you ask people, should your neighbour be allowed to do what they want with their own house, you may get a different answer, I think. So we can easily see the conflict in the permitted development rights can create. So the fact is, where something is permitted development, even if it causes damage and even if it would be contrary to policy, because it's just allowed as a matter of right under national legislation, the policies of the neighbourhood plan will never apply. And we have seen you know, development that's less than ideal going ahead. So the neighbourhood plan policies only apply where a planning application is required, and there's no opportunity to apply them in the case of permitted development rights. I don't know if that answers the question, or if there's any further questions.
Have you had an example, Dave, of some really successful neighbourhood plans that have, in your view, in your professional view, ticked all the boxes? Because I've looked at quite a few neighbourhood plans in the formation of all of them locally, from West Hampstead, Fortune Green to Hampstead Town, to Redington Frognal, all our little local ones as well. And it would be interesting to know to what extent you've, your professional view, and you can be as frank as you like as to whether they're worth the paper they're written on.
Okay, so I'll and I'm talking as a generalisation here about neighbourhood plans and across England, talking of neighbourhood plans. So they are part of the statutory development plan, and that gives them real weight in law. And we do see reports. It's not infrequent that we see reports in the planning press where a neighbourhood plan has actually positively allowed development to go ahead, or has led to a refusal. So we know that the neighbourhood plan has had a fundamental impact in some instances on that. Where I think there's sometimes been disappointment from neighbourhood plans, I think there are different reasons for that. And but I think one of the reasons sometimes is there are plans where the thinking is really good, the analysis is really good, and the understanding of the area, but it's translating that into policies, into binding policies. And I've sometimes been asked to review plans that have been made in the past, and to look whether they need to be reviewed. And what I've found in some instances is really good analysis, but when you read the policies, they read more like narrative or aspiration. And actually, to refuse a planning application, they've got to set really clear requirements for development to meet, and it's got to be clear whether the development meets those or not. So it's translating the aspiration, the generalities into very specific and very checklisty policies. And I think there's an awful lot of neighbourhood plans out there where the quality of drafting has actually compromised the plan's impact and ability to influence decisions. It is about specific policies, either enabling development or setting clear requirements for development to meet, or making clear where development would be unsustainable. And the more descriptive or aspirational the policy, the less it will work in that practical way. Anyone else?
I've got a question, please.
Fire away.
So that's all very helpful. Thank you very much indeed for setting everything out. In the light of what you've just explained about the need for policies to be really tightly focused, what went wrong with the planning decisions of the planning committee of the 8th of July? What could we have done differently in the neighbourhood plan to prevent those?
Well, I don't really want to refer to any specific recent planning decisions, but I think that, you know, there's obviously different issues. There's how clearly the policies set out requirements for development to meet or not to meet. So the plan needs to be implemented properly. The policies need to be taken into account by the planning authority, and they need to be making decisions in accordance with the policies. And as this plan comes after the local plan, it should be clear that more weight has been given to the neighbourhood plan. So, you know, in the level of analysis in reports and the, for example, that should be similar. So it's a combination of factors, you know, and that's why it's not just about making representations before, but if a decision, if there does seem to be a question mark, then it's about writing to the authority and just saying, look, what, you know, pointing out where it appears there could have been a problem, you know.
Thank you very much.
I think generally with policies, though, I think as clear and as concise as possible tends to work best. And you know, in reality, you get officers of different experience, different levels of experience, etc. So the clearer, more bullet pointy, and more concise a plan is, the better. I think what doesn't work particularly well, I have seen some neighbourhood plans where they've made reference to external documents, and sometimes external documents like character appraisals, which aren't policy documents, they're evidence documents, and there's no clear policy requirements. And I think referring to an external document anyway, it you know, it just makes it so difficult to use the plan if you've got to read other documents with it. So making sure the policies have everything in that is needed as well, I think, is crucial. I mean, I think any policy that says must be done in accordance with an external character appraisal, for example, the policy simply doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. So it's more about setting out what those essential elements of character are in policy. You know, speaking as a generality, that is. Any other questions? I mean, if not, Nancy knows where I am, and Nancy could you know, ask any other questions that arise. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well, if there's no further questions, shall we draw to a close?